All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin a good tavach. I hope that everyone had a beautiful and meaningful and uplifting Shabbos. It is a great zchus, Baruch Hashem, to begin another week of learning together. So we are picking up. Well, first we'll begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsor for the month of Teves, Mrs. Selma Woolf, with immense gratitude for the refuos from our Kadosh Baruch Hu, and the zchus of refuah sheleima for all of those in need, and the zchus of our brave soldiers, and the zchus of the return of all of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsors: Chazzan Mark Childs of Santa Barbara, California, in appreciation for the DAF YOMI share and for the refuah sheleima of Binyomin Yankel ben Bayla. And our DAF YOMI share sponsor today, plus the sponsor for the pastries, Alan and Sue Myrowitz, in memory of Sue's mother, Mindel Bas Shlomo Todros, zichron. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, the Neshama will have an aliya and the family a Neshama. We dedicate Maseches Baba Kamo Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Eliyahu Harush. Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, Kadosh Baruch Hu will provide an aliya for his Neshama and a Neshama for his family. I want to say also, Saeed made a very beautiful suggestion that at the Shir we should always dedicate our learning in the event that there were precious soldiers who fell in battle the day before, to be able to dedicate our learning Le'ilui Nishmasam. So this was a particularly difficult weekend for Klal Yisrael with the loss of 14 soldiers. So we dedicate our learning Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Eliyahu Meir Ohana, Sergeant First Class Eliasaf Shoshan, Sergeant First Class Ohad Ashur, Staff Sergeant David Bogidansky, Staff Sergeant Itamar Shemen, and Staff Sergeant Gal Hershko, Staff Sergeant Nir Fa'al Knanian, Staff Sergeant Birho Kasi, Major Shai Terman, Sergeant Major Alexander Spitz, and Captain Oshri Moshe Butsak. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH and their Mesiras Nefesh, the Neshama should have an aliya on their families in Nechama. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is Nun Beis 52, and we have. I just mentioned, sometimes like when we hear this, and we dedicate Le'ilui Nishmas, our precious soldiers, like it's such a overwhelming feeling of sadness, and it is an overwhelming feeling of sadness. It is the karbanos like Klal Yisrael. But remember, when we remember Jews who have given their lives al kiddush Hashem, and Jews who have died defending Am Yisroel and Eretz Yisrael, what you have to hear over and over in your heart and in your ears and in your soul is V'amar lach b'damayich chayi, V'amar lach b'damayich chayi. When Jews give their lives al kiddush Hashem for Am Yisroel and for Eretz Yisrael, the sacrifice is heartbreaking. But the sacrifice paves the way for the individual and collective continued life of Klal Yisrael. So when we hear this, the reaction shouldn't just be one of sadness. The reaction is, if there are Jews who gave their life over Shabbos for Am Yisrael, for us, it should push us to lead more impactful lives. If we remain the same after their ultimate sacrifice, then that's a sacrifice in vain. But if we recognize that people, for many of us, half our age, have died on the front lines of the war of Klal Yisrael, they gave their lives for us, for Am Yisrael. Someone gave their life for me over Shabbos. And if someone gave their life for me, that means they believe that their sacrifice is worth it, because they believe that I have a life that is worth living. Our avodah is to prove them right. Our avodah is to say to each of these precious soldiers, just like each of the precious people who were murdered al kiddush Hashem on October 7th, if you gave your life al kiddush Hashem ha'am va'aretz, that means you gave up your life for me. If you gave up your life for me, I pledge to you that I'm going to do something meaningful with the life I have. That's our avodah, and not to craft and not to feel sad and not to feel bad, but to do something that is worthy of their sacrifice. Maybe we zoch Hashem to do so today and in the days ahead. So with that, let us begin. A lot to do this week. DAF YOMI Pastries. That is also before I start. Also, I just want to mention tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning is Alan called I said a regular Sunday schedule. There's a shear, so we have davening at 7:15, shear at 8 o'clock, and then there's a special, Monday morning or legal holiday installment. Rabbi Pinchas Gross, Rabbi Penny Gross, who's one of the outstanding Rabbanim and Talmidei Chachamim here in the community, is going to be giving a little bit of a more in-depth Ian shear. There'll be an opportunity to prepare Mara Makomos, sources, that'll just be for about 20 minutes, and then a shear, I forgot what the topic is, I think it's Barshal Shnei Shutzvin, joint partners in crime, the dynamics of a jointly owned pit. And Rabbi Gross is going to bring us some of the contemporary applications of that. And yes, there will be food. There's breakfast. I can see some of you are looking at me like blankly. Yeah, there's breakfast. There is breakfast. Right? There's breakfast, and it's just, just a wonderful opportunity. Sometimes we do these sugis and DAF YOMI, and we're blowing through them. We're just going through them so quickly. So it's nice. I'm sure most of you have off from work tomorrow. I'm probably the only person who doesn't have off from work tomorrow, right? But just take the opportunity. Take the opportunity to spend a couple of extra minutes in the base medrash, again with chaverim, with a good breakfast, with an outstanding Talmud Chacham. Just a nice way to begin the week. I'll repost the flyer a little bit later. So good. Let's begin. Last line under Aleph on days. Last line 51b says the Gemara. Rabbi Shmuel Levi. Hamocher ba'is lechavero. A person sells a home to his friend. Top of Nun base 52a. Kevan shemasra lo mafteach kona. So what's an interesting case? You sell your house, right? Reuven sells a house to Shimon. Once Reuven goes ahead and hands over the key, ultimately, again, Shimon has acquired the property. Shimon has acquired the property. Says Gemara, well, what's the case? Now, we'll say, Bepashtas, handing over a key is not a form of kinyan. Remember, again, in halacha, in order to convey ownership from one person to another, in order to convey ownership of an object, there has to be a mechanism of kinyan. So now, okay, Reuven's selling a house to Shimon. So it's very nice that Reuven gives him the keys, but what is that? What is that? What is the actual mechanism of acquisition? So it says the Gemara, Iba Kaspa, so if it's money, look at the Kaspa, then money should acquire the home. Iba Chazaka, remember what's Chazaka? Chazaka is a proprietary act, an act that demonstrates ownership. So what would be an example of Chazaka by a home? An example of Chazaka by a home? Opening and closing the door, right? Or lock, I should say better, like opening and closing and locking the door, right? Because generally only the owner goes ahead and opens. Well, I guess if you live in Baltimore, a lot of people open your door, right? But in general, only the owner is supposed to open the door, right? So open and close the door. So the Gemara says, if it's chazaka, then chazaka, the olam bechazaka. The Gemara says, in reality, it's chazaka. That's what's happening over here. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, in general, here's what's interesting. So if Reuven's selling his house to Shimon, so Reuven says to Shimon, okay, now Shimon, do a chazaka, do a proprietary act, an act of ownership. Now, in general, the act of chazaka has to be preceded by a verbal command, right? Reuven says, Shimon, I'm selling you my house. Go and acquire it. The Gemara says, we'll say ultimately again. So the idea the Gemara is conveying to us is that once Reuven hands over the keys, the act of handing over the key itself is the equivalent of saying, go and perform a proprietary act. So we'll say, so it's interesting, essentially, handing over the keys is a form of non-verbal communication. You hand it over, that's the equivalent of saying, go and perform a proprietary act. Incredible. Both say this is such a great Gemara. Somebody sells a flock. An eider is a flock of animals. Someone sells a flock of animals to his friend. So let's keep it right. Reuven is selling a flock to Shimon. Once Reuven hands over to Shimon the mashchuchis, okay, so once he hands over, we don't know what a mashchuchis is. We'll say, all that I know mashchuchis is, what word is in mashchuchis? Mashach, right? To go ahead and to pull. Right, to go ahead and to pull. So, okay, but we don't know what a mashchuchis is. So once he hands him over the mashchuchis, kana, Shimon acquires it. The Gemara says, okay, well, what's the case? Hy'd, even Mashicha, like Mashicha, and I will say it's livestock. So if you're talking about livestock, so if you're talking about Mashicha, I will say what's Mashicha? Mashicha is the act of pulling the animal close to you. Now remember, Mashicha doesn't necessarily require a physical pulling of the animal, right? Remember, Korela v'hiba. If you call out to the animal, right, here goat, and the goat comes to you, so the mice again, That's also called Mashicha. So if you're acquiring it with Mashicha, then let it be acquired Mashicha. Even Masira, Rabbi say, what's Masira? Masira is actually handing over of the animal, either handing over of the reins, handing over, taking hold of the mane of the animal. So if it's Masira, Mashicha. We're talking about over here with Mashicha. That's what's happening. Gemara says, Bayla meimarle lech mishoch v'kani. They will say, so it's interesting that in all of these cases, the common denominator is imud Mashicha, the owner of the animal has to say to the purchaser, go and do Mashicha. In other words, as the purchaser, you don't have the right to do Mashicha until you are green-lighted by the owner. And therefore the Gemara says, V'chevan de masala mashchuchis keman da'amar lech mishoch v'kani. And once the owner gives over to the purchaser, the mashchuchis, giving over of the mashchuchis, is the equivalent of the owner saying, go and do Mashicha. Now, I'll say this is all great. Only one small outstanding issue, which is my mashchuchis. What is a mashchuchis? So the Rebbe says incredible. Hacha targimu karkashta. So we'll say some explain it as a bell. Rashi says garsinon zug shemekarkish balifnei ha'eder v'holich kula achrav. So apparently there's like a bell that when you would ring it, the herd would come following. So some say again, so that's the mashchuchis. So therefore, again, we'll say, so to put this together, Reuven's selling his flock, his herd, to Shimon. He hands over the bell to Shimon. Now Shimon rings the bell. What happens when he rings the bell? The herd comes forward. That's Mashicha. But the idea being is, even though normally Reuven would have to say to Shimon, go and do Mashicha, the act of handing over the bell is in essence the statement of go and do Mashicha. Okay. Rabbi Yaakov says, no, that's not Mashchuchis. Mashchuchis is Iza de Azla Beresh Idra. Shabbos say this is incredible. So the Mashchuchis is the goat that walks at the head of the herd. Walked out, supposed to look at Rashi. Iza de Azla Beresh Azla. It's in those short lines, about 5 lines in. Iza de Azla Beresh Adra. Rashi says, Yesh the Bala Eider, Eis Charif. So every herd has like the A student goat, right? This is like the alpha goat, right? And so this is the alpha goat. So what happens? Yesh bala eder eis charif v'derech ha'izim lahalich barosh va'eder holich hareim. And what happens, Rabbi? So what happens in the flock? What happens in the herd? One goat goes in the front, and everyone else follows him. So we'll say, so therefore again, Rabbi Yaakov posits that the mashchuchis is the goat that walks at the front. And we'll say, it's an incredible, so what do you see from here? It's the derech of goats to follow blindly. It's the derech of goats. That's what goats do, right? A goat goes ahead and walks in the front, right? And the alpha goat is there and everyone else follows behind. I was saying, whether we recognize this or not in life, so often we just end up following the goat that's in front of us. We do this socially, we do this lifestyle-wise, we do this in the chinuch of our children, right? That whatever everyone around us is doing, that's what we do as well, right? Whatever influences everyone else allows, that's what I allow. Whatever lifestyle needs everyone else has, that's what I have to have also. Okay, so just recognize if I do that, I'm living like a goat. That's what happens in the goat in the goat veld, right? In the goat world, one goat is in front, right? Whoever's the loudest goat, the flashiest goat, the coolest goat, right? He's in the front, right? Oh, goat, right? What's that? Greatest of all time, right? Goat, right? So the goat, right? The goat is in the front. The goat is in the front. He'll say, and what happens? And everyone else just simply follows behind. Again, works for goats, certainly should try to be avoided ultimately again for mankind. So the Gemara says, Kididarash hu glila alei Rav Chisda. The Gemara says incredible. There was a certain Galilean who went ahead and darshan by Rav Chisda, and he said as follows, Kad rogiz raya al ana, avid linagdos samusa. The Gemara says it's very profound. Literally translated, when the shepherd gets angry at the flock, he causes ultimately, again, the lead goat to become blind. And I will say, now what happens when the lead goat becomes blind? The lead goat ultimately falls into a pit, and guess what? Everyone else follows him into the pit as well. Now, it's a metaphor. The metaphor, of course, is the shepherd is the Ribono Shel Olam. The flock ultimately is Klal Yisrael, and the lead goat is leadership. Very profound Gemara will say this. Sometimes when the Ribono Shel Olam gets upset at HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what he does is he provides us with blind leaders. And so ultimately, again, unfortunately, we follow the blind leadership over into the abyss. Look at Rashi. Avid linagda samuso. Rashi says, La'is haMosheches menake einah, v'nechsheles v'nofeles beboros, va'eder achareh kach, kishamakom nifra misonei Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gets upset at Klal Yisrael. He goes in and appoints over them leaders ultimately, again, who are unfit. And therefore it turns out that unfortunately the masses follow the leadership into the abyss. It should say is an interesting yisod. In general in Yiddishkeit, we do not believe in the infallibility of leaders. It's actually a very important yisod, right? Only other religions have this concept of infallibility. We do not possess that concept. That's the reason why the Torah Kedosha goes out of its way to point out the mistakes of our leaders, right? Why does the Torah go out of its way to point multiple times? Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock. Okay, we got it. He hit the rock. One mistake, but it's stated over and over and over and over. Why? Because you should know that even the greatest man who ever lived, right? I would call Moshe Rabbeinu the goat, but that would be inappropriate, right? Right? Even Moshe Rabbeinu, even the greatest man who ever lived, the only person in the history of mankind to ever speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, panim upon him, made mistakes. That's the lesson that the Torah wants us to understand, which is why sometimes we see like great people do things that's not good, and like it causes like this crisis in leadership. Great people and leaders are people too. So they're going to sometimes say things that are not correct. And they're going to sometimes do things that are not correct. Why? Because they're humans. If Moshe Rabbeinu made a mistake, you think our contemporary leadership is not going to make mistakes? Our avod is to recognize that even sometimes when leaders make mistakes, they're still great people. And they're still capable of providing dynamic and incredible leadership even with all of those mistakes. But we also have to be in tune to recognize when those mistakes are being made. And also remember again, how do you judge when a leader is making a mistake? Right? Who's making that judgment? Who's making that decision? Right? Who's the decisor ultimately again of what's... So these are all complicated things. But just to point out that sometimes even great people make mistakes, and it's important for us. Now here the Gemara is actually talking about something even more dramatic, which is something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is upset with the klal. He dafka provides bad leadership as a punishment ultimately for the people. Which I will say sometimes is a very scary statement also. I think we see this a lot, like when we look at like world leadership, like global leadership, and sometimes how it looks like there's such a lack of like moral leadership, and there's such a lack of upstanding people. Sometimes it's important for us, the constituents, to do a little bit of cheshbon nefesh. Leadership is a reflection of the constituents. It's very important to understand. And sometimes when there's a lack of leadership, it's not a failure in leadership. Sometimes it's a failure in the flock. Important for us to go ahead and do cheshbon nefesh when we feel, either on a communal level or on a global level, that we lack the right kind of leadership. Sometimes it's not the fault of the leaders. Sometimes it requires us to up our game just a little bit more. Mishnah. Okay, Kisa Arisha. I'm going to say back to bar. This is great stuff, by the way. I'm just giving you coming attractions. Great stuff. Kisa Arisha. So we'll say a lot of great cases over here. This, by the way, this Gemara, this sugi is going to be the topic for tomorrow's show, very gross. But I'll say, so just, I'm telling you, if you could come after you finish opening presents, if you could come, Kisa Rishon. Again, we're pluralistic, right? So one says as follows. So Kisa Harishon, Uva Sheni Matzim Agulas. We'll say, now listen to this. So let's go weiter. So you have to cover the pit. Kisra says, so now this is talking about over here, right? So Reuven went ahead and covered the pit. Uba sheni matzamagula. Now we'll say, now over here, Shimon comes along, and Shimon finds that the pit is open. The pit is open. Velo kisa sheni. Now we'll say, we'll discuss exactly what the dynamics of this case are. And now what happens? Shimon doesn't go ahead and cover it. So we'll say, so again, Reuven covered the pit. Something happened. We don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know what. Shimon comes along, finds the pit uncovered, right? Shimon doesn't remedy the situation. What's the halacha? Chayiv. Shimon's chayiv. Shimon's going to be chayiv. So the Gemara says, Kisol karai v'nafal kisol karai. So that's case one. Next case, Kisol karai, Reuven went ahead and covered the pit appropriately. V'nafal socho shar or chamar. And then I will say what happened. So Reuven did the correct job in covering the pit. This sounds like despite that, an ox or a donkey falls in. So what's the halacha? Pater. Ultimately, Reuven is pater. Why is Reuven pater? Just because he did his job. Right? He did what he was supposed to do. Lo kisol karai v'nafal l'socho shar chamar u'meis chayiv. If Reuven didn't cover the pit appropriately and the animal fell in and died, so Reuven is going to be chayiv. Nafal lefarim mikol kriya. So I'll say next case. This is actually going to be more in Tuesday's daf. Monday's daf. Nafal lefarim mikol kriya chayiv. We'll say if sounds like what's happening over here is Reuven's in the pit, he's digging the pit, and as a result of the sound of digging the pit, the animal gets startled and falls forward. Chayiv. Reuven's going to be chayiv. The acharov, if the animal gets started and falls backwards and falls into the pit and dies, the acharov we call it kriya pater. Okay. Nafal usocho shar v'kela v'nishtabru. But so what happens if a shar is carrying utensils, falls into the pit, and the utensils break? Shar is okay, but the utensils break. Chamor v'kela v'niskaru, or a donkey falls in, also laden with utensils, and the utensils rip. Chayiv ala behema upater ala kelim. Ultimately, again, you're chayiv for damage to the animal, but pater for the kelim. I've also seen this many times before. Nafal l'socho, so we'll say, now why is that? Because remember again, for bar, you're only chayiv for adam and behema. Damage is done to people and to animals. You are pater on kelim. We'll discuss the drasha for that in the sugya. Nafal l'socho shar cheresh shote v'katan chayiv. So I'll say this is interesting. If the shar, now I'll say here, this is not talking about a shar that belongs to a cheresh shota v'katan. Rather, it's talking about a shar that is a cheresh shota v'katan. Very interesting. What happens if the shar itself is deaf and mute? Again, how exactly you're gauging this, right? Can you imagine? And my shar is so uncommunicative. I just wish he would tell me how he's really feeling. So we'll see exactly what these cases are. So cheresh shar shota v'katan chayiv vein obas eved o ama pater. Ultimately, again, if ultimately the bar does damage, or you have a bein bas means a katan. These are people now, right? People, a bein or a bas, ultimately again, or an amma or an eved or an amma, patra, ultimately you're exempt. Again, I will say we'll define the parameters of all of those cases. So I will say, so now let's analyze the first case in the Mishnah. So the first case of the Mishnah, so remember again, what do we have? We have ultimately, again, Reuven and Shimon, right? So Reuven covered the pit. Something subsequently happened. Shimon came upon the pit, and Shimon finds the pit uncovered. So what's the halacha? What's the halacha? And now Shimon doesn't cover it. So the halacha is that Shimon now assumes liability for the bar. Shimon assumes liability for the bar. So we'll say, so now here's what's interesting. So the Gemara asks, V'rishon ad imas mifter. Here's the interesting shaila. So now, what it sounds like is Reuven has no liability. So the question is, how long does Reuven's lack of liability continue for? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi is in the intermediate wide lines. V'rishon ad imas mifter heicha debar sheni v'nishtamish bo v'lo kiso ad imas ramya kula chiyuva asheni v'rishon pater. So both say, so now, here's what the Mishnah teaches me. The Mishnah teaches me Reuven covered the pit, right? He did his job. Something happened. We'll discuss what happened. Something happened. The covering is no longer there. Shimon sees the pit is uncovered. Shimon fails to cover it. So now liability shifts to Shimon. Now the Gemara essentially asks is, how long does Shimon have sole liability? In other words, Reuven was the owner of this pit. Right? So how long does Shimon have sole liability? But I will say, I'll point out over here, the way the Rambam frames this case is that this is a case of a bar shel shnei shutfin. Again, we'll talk about this in greater depth. So that's how the Rambam understands this case. Reuven and Shimon own the pit jointly. They own the pit jointly. Reuven did the job and covered the pit. Shimon comes across it. It's uncovered. Shimon fails to cover it. So now the Mishnah tells me Shimon assumes complete liability. Now the Gemara asks, is there a point in time where Reuven shares in liability as well? So the Gemara says, we'll say very interesting. So the Gemara says, so Rav says, yeah, in other words, when there enough time elapses that Reuven should find out about the uncovered pit, then he assumes liability. So we'll say, so again, whatever that amount of time is, right? Again, it's a bit amorphous and a bit ambiguous, but the point that the Gemara is making over here is there does come a certain point in time where Reuven once again begins to re-share in liability. When does that occur? Enough time elapses that he should know that the pit is uncovered. Shmuel says, enough time goes by that someone goes ahead and lets him know that it's uncovered. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says enough time elapses that Reuben finds out and he's able to hire workers and get the pit covered again. In other words, what Rabbi Yochanan is adding on over here is Reuben finding out is not enough. It's not enough because remember, again, I will say to go ahead and create a proper covering for a pit is an avodah. Right? You have to hire workers. You have to have it measured. You have to do this. It's a contracting thing. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, it's not enough just for Reuben to know that it's uncovered, but Reuben has to have enough time to know that it's uncovered and have enough time to remedy the situation. So the Gemara goes right there. So the Gemara says, fine. It's good. So, kiso karai, so I say, that's case one. So let's just talk about this just a second. So I say, so this is how the Rambam paskin. So listen to this Rambam. This is in Perek Yud Beis Hilchos Niskei Mammon. Perek Yud Beis Hilchos Niskei Mammon. Okay, fine. Halacha Zayin. So listen to this. Bar shal shnei shutvin. So you have a bar that belongs to two people, two partners. Vava rishon v'lo kiso. Right. So what? No. Sorry. Kiso harishon avashen v'samagula. So here's the case. Reuven did his job. Right. He did his job. It's actually the middle of the halacha. He did his job. He covered the pit. So what happens? Ubashen v'samagula. Now Shimon comes along and finds that the pit is no longer covered. Kiso hasheni, right? So v'lo kiso hasheni chayiv, and now Shimon doesn't do anything. Shimon is liable. Va'ad a mosai yi hasheni levado chayiv. Now, boss, and remember again, this is a pit that belongs to partners. So the shaila is, for how long does Shimon retain sole liability? Here the Rambam paskins ad sheyeda harishon shabar megula ukedei sheyiskar polim v'yichros arazim v'yichasenu. So Rabbi says that's the halacha. So in other words, Shimon assumes full liability until Reuven finds out and has enough time to go ahead and hire workers and cover the pit. Once that amount of time elapses, then halacha l'maisa, liability then once again becomes what Rabbi say, shared liability. Because remember again, this is a pit owned both by Reuven and Shimon. Okay, so that's the halacha. Fascinating case. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, so we'll say, now this is very interesting. In this case over here, next case in Mishnah, so remember, Reuven covered the pit appropriately. Now we'll say, this doesn't have to be a case of Shnei Shutzvin. This could just be a pit owned by one individual. So what happens? Reuven covered the pit, and what happens? A shor or a chamor falls in and dies. Reuven's patus. Gemara says, I don't understand. It doesn't make sense. Kevan de kisag haroi hechi nafel. I don't understand. Mamashach. If you covered the pit correctly, then what? How did an animal fall in and die? Rabbi Yitzchak Barchana Amar Shehisli Misocho. Well, so here's what's interesting. The cover. What's the word? Not eroded. Rotted. Right. The cover got worms in it. Right. Pashas like a worm cover, termites. Right, and it eroded. It just eroded, it rotted. And that's how the animal fell in. Then I will say, now, by the way, this raises a fascinating idea. So what is the Mishnah essentially saying? There's a recognition that halacha l'maisa, you could do your best, but it doesn't mean that it's foolproof. So what the Mishnah is saying is like this, Reuven, if you did the appropriate job covering the pit, if something subsequently happened that the cover rotted and the animal fell in and died, you are exempt from liability. You did your part. Now, here's what's going to be interesting. Is there a din of maintenance, right, on the cover of the pit? So that we're going to discuss. But Bepashtos, what the Mishnah is teaching me is, I have a pit, I'm a responsible Jew, I try to be every day, I try to be a responsible Jew, I covered my pit, right? Now what ends up happening? A proper covered, it's right, it's proper. Now what happens? Over time, it rots, an animal steps over it, falls in and dies, I am potter. So the Gemara says, Bayla. So we'll say, now watch this. This is some fascinating cases over here. Kiso lemish yachal lamo lifnei sharim, ve'yachal lamo lifnei gimolim. We'll say, watch this. So let's say again, I bought the pit cover, right, that is capable of withstanding the weight of oxen. but not of camels. Camels. No, not knockoff. I went to Home Depot. I bought the proper one, right? I bought the proper one because, again, we'll discuss why in just a moment. Watch this. So I bought the oxen cover, not the camel cover. Now what happens? So sure enough, camels come walking by. Now when the camels walked on, nothing happened to the camels except what? They damaged the cover. Now as a result, what happens afterwards? The oxen walk by and they fall in and die. So we'll say, now what's the halacha? Mai. So the Gemara says, so what's the case? And I will say, so here's what's interesting over here, right? So technically speaking, so in other words, here, so what's fascinating about this case? What's fascinating about the case is, what died in the pit? An ox. Right? Now technically speaking, the cover that was on the pit was what? Was good enough for oxen, but it was damaged ultimately by the camels. So the Gemara says, okay, well, let's what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, Amri hechi dami, what's the case? So it's like, if I live in a place, if my pit is in a place where there are camels, then what? Stop being so cheap. Right? If I live in a place where there's camels, buy the camel cover. And failure to do so, ultimately, again, it's pshia, is negligence. And if I live in a place where there aren't camels, then honestly, I will say, so look, if I live in a place where there aren't camels, right, so I just bought the ox cover, right, and again, somehow camels wandered through, that's not my fault, right, that is not my fault. And therefore, when the camels weaken the cover, and the ox subsequently goes on the cover and falls through, I should not be chayiv for that. What's the case? I will say the case is, you're right, I live in a place, the pit is in a place where camels are not common, but sometimes they travel through. Sometimes they travel leprakim. So the Gemara says now, mi amrinon kevan da asal leprakim poshehu di Bayla lasuke adaite o dilma kevan da hashta mihas leka onesu. So now here's the shaila. Essentially, when safeguarding my pit, do I just have to deal with what is the normative reality, or do I have to deal with what is the possible reality? So that's really the shaila. So do we say, listen, here's according to this Gemara, according to everyone, if you live in a place, right, or if the pit is in a place where there are never camels, then what's the halacha? I am not obligated to safeguard the bar for camels, only for oxen. The issue over here is that the pit is in a place where sometimes there are camels, but it's infrequent. It's uncommon. But does it happen? It's happened. So Abba says, now here's the shaila. Am I obligated to safeguard the pit against the rare possibility of camels, and therefore failure to do so is considered to be negligence, or not? Or no? I'm obligated to safeguard my pit in a way that's normal. That's normal. What's normal? Normal is oxen. Normal does not require safeguarding against camels. That's the shaila. So Gemara says as follows. So Gemara says, Tashma, let's analyze. Kiso karai v'nafal osocho shar. So we learned if you covered your pit in the appropriate way and the shar fell into it, shar chamar, umeis pater. And ultimately again, so if you safeguarded your pit in the appropriate way and the shar chamar falls in, you're pater. Seichi dami, what's the case? Heichi dami. Ilema karai l'shvarim karai l'gimalim. So I'll say, if you say that the pit cover is proper for oxen and proper for camels, so heichi nafal. How did it fall in to begin with? Elalav karai l'shvarim. Rather, we'll say it must be that what? It must be that halacha l'maisa, again, it's appropriate for shvarim, for oxen, amud beis, the low karai l'gimalim, and it's not fit for camels. So the Gemara says, the Isa case. Let's analyze this. We'll say, first of all, special welcome to Binyomin, who's joining us again, the youngest member of our shir this morning, Baruch Hashem. Chavre, can you imagine it? How old are you? 11. Chavre, can you imagine what we would be in life? I should say, what I would be in life if, like, I was 11 years old spending Sunday mornings learning Bava Kama. Oh my gosh. Well, all right, great things in store for this young man. You'll be able to say, I remember when he was a kid, steiging in shir on Sunday morning. Incredible. All right, see, that's the beautiful hope of Klal Yisrael right there. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, here we go. The Gemara says, so what's the case? So if we're talking about a situation where ultimately, again, there are camels around, right? Amai pater posheahu. So we'll say ultimately again, and again, if I'm mentioning that table, I also want to wish happy birthday to Yoni Frager. So yeah, right over there. Mazel Tov Yoni, Mazel Tov Yoni, I may have asked him Shalom Tovos. So the Gemara says as follows: the Shchichi Gimalim. So ultimately again, if halacha l'maisa, again, there are camels around. So the Gemara says, "Amai potter." So then ultimately again, why should I be potter? Poshehu. V'idelo Shchichi Gimalim. If at the end of the day there are no camels, so pshita onasu. But let's say that ultimately is an ones. Elalav da'asin leprakim. So we'll say rather it must be that what? Sometimes there are camels. Normally there's not camel traffic, right? But episodically it does occur. Va'asu gimal and var'ua. So what happened? Camels walked over the pit cover. They weakened it. Va'asu shvarim v'naflubei. And then the oxen came in and they fell in. The katani potter. And I will say, yet what do we see? Potter. So what do you see from here? So what do you see from here? What you see from here is that halacha l'maisa, when covering a pit, you're only obligated to cover in a way that deals with normative realities, not episodic realities. So since now it's not normal ultimately again for there to be camels, therefore halacha l'maisa, even though it's possible that once in a while there is a camel, you're not obligated to safeguard that. Amri lo, no, that's not what we're saying at all. In reality, ultimately again, you should have to, if camels sometimes do traverse this area, you are obligated to put in a camel-proof cover. So the Gemara says, so the Olam Karai L'Sharon Karai L'Gmalim, then the Gakashi L'Cha Hechi Nafal. So he'll say 1 second. So he'll say, if the cover was strong enough for camels and strong enough for oxen, so how did anything fall through? Rabbi Yisrael Barachana Sheslim. So we'll say second wide line. No, we'll say, because remember, it rotted. So in other words, the Gemara is suggesting maybe the casing, maybe the halacha is that we'll say when putting on a pit cover, you are obligated to ensure that pit cover could withstand whatever kind of animal traffic comes, whether it's regular traffic or infrequent traffic. So if there are camels that sometimes traverse the area, you are obligated to make sure that the cover is strong enough to withstand the weight of camels. I said that's the case, that you have such a foolproof cover, then how did the animal fall through? It rotted. And I will say once again, so what's the Mishnah's what's the halacha reinforcing? That if you cover the pit in the appropriate way, and then it subsequently rots, and the animal falls through, you're not liable. Again, we're going to still qualify the scope of that halacha, but that seems to be what's happening over and over. We'll say second of the widest lines. So Tashma, lo kisal kara even afalasocho shara chamar. If you didn't cover the pit in the right way, and an animal fell in and died, you're chayiv. Okay? Hechidami, what's the case? If the cover is not usable, it doesn't protect oxen or camels, so pshita, right? So pshita, so we'll say, obviously that means you didn't do a sufficient job in covering your pit. If you didn't do a sufficient job in covering your pit and an animal falls in, of course you're going to be chayiv. Rather, we'll say it must be a case of what? Where you covered the pit, and it was good for oxen, but not good for camels. So hechidami, once again, what's the case? Say if you live in a place where camels are frequent, then failure to cover the pit with a camel-proof cover is pshia's negligence. And if there are no camels in the area, anasu, then I will say that's an extenuating circumstance. Of course, that should be liable. Elalav, the asin leprakim. Rather, I will say, what's the case? The case is where normally there's no camel traffic, but sometimes there is camel traffic. So what happens? And camels came along, walked over the pit cover. What do I keep on? What's the right word? Weakened it. Then subsequently, oxen walked over it, and ox walked over it and fell in. Vekatani chayiv. And it says that she chayiv. So what do you see from here? Alma, kevan da asin leprakim, poshehu. Bayla asuki adaide. But say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, when there are camels in the area, even infrequently, when putting a cover on your pit, you must make sure it is strong enough to withstand the weight of camels. And failure to do so ultimately again makes you liable. Tushmar says no. Li'olam karai l'shvar v'lo karai l'gmalim. Maybe the case ultimately is where it was a cover that was fit for oxen, not fit for camels. Ushrichi gimalim. And you'll say that there are camels around. The kakashi lecha poshehu. You'll say, well, if that's the case, that there is camel traffic, and your cover is only strong enough for oxen, not for camels, and then it will say, so you're a posher, you're negligent. To which the Gemara says, Aidi di nasiv reisha kisal karai, nasiv seifa nami lo kisal karai. Shabbos said, the Gemara answers, you're right, it's a case of Shia, but ultimately, again, the Mishnah is just using symmetrical lashon. Ikadami, others say, Ha nami vaday lo yibaylan. This is not really a question. Why? Dichevan da'asan leprakim poshehu. Well, say, if you have camels that come, leprakim, at intervals, in other words, that it's not uncommon for there to be camel traffic, then you have an obligation to safeguard your pit with a camel-proof cover. And failure to do so is pshia, negligence. So the Gemara says, Di'ibay le'asuki adaite. Ki baylan, what's the kasha? So ki baylan, ha'chiu di baylan. Here we go. Kiso kisish yachol la'amo b'fnei shvarim, ve'ino yachol la'amo b'fnei gimalin. Ushchichi gimalin. Now listen, now watch this case. This is great. So here's the question. So we'll say, so again, here's what everyone seems to agree with. Halacha l'maisa, right? If you have a situation where, in the area where you are, it's right. It is common to have oxen, and it's common to have, or even if it's not so common, but it happens that there are camels. You're obligated to safeguard your pit in a way that is not just ox-proof, but is camel-proof. Okay? So what's our question? We'll say, watch this. So So we'll say, now what happened? You went ahead, so here's the case in question. I covered my pit with a cover that is capable of withstanding the weight of oxen, not capable of withstanding the weight of camels. And I live in a place where there aren't camels. Now we'll say, right off the bat, what would you say? Poshea. Now watch this. Watch this little knetch over here. V'sliya misocho. Now we'll say, now what ended up happening? The cover rotted. So mahu. So we'll say, so now what ends up happening? An animal falls through. Now we'll say, now, interesting. So, okay, mahu. So what's the halacha? Mahu. So mahu. Good. So we'll say, so now watch this for just a second. So now, what ends up happening, let me fill in the blanks in this case over here. What ends up happening over here is, the ox goes ahead and falls through and dies. Now, technically speaking, right, why did the ox fall through? Right? Because it rotted. But the truth is, and again, the rottage, is rottage a word? All right, like I said, the rottage goes ahead and caused the ox to fall through. Now, here's what's interesting. Technically speaking, that ox could have also just as easily fallen through if what? If a camel walked over it, weakened it, then the ox would have fallen through also. So what happens, so what's interesting over here in this case is, you really have an unfit cover. Why is it unfit? Because I'm living in a place where there's camels and there's oxen. Yet the cover is only good for oxen, not camels. But at the end of the day, the reason the ox fell in is not because of the camels. It's because of the rottage. So I will say, so now the sheilema is, what's the liability? Such a fascinating question. So the Gemara says, Mao, so then we say, listen, the way we look at this cover is you're a poshea. And once you're negligent in one area, say if I will say essentially what we make this is an unfit cover. And therefore again, any damage that occurs you're going to be liable for. On the other hand, Dilma, lo minan migo. So we'll say, so that's the shaila. Do we say migo now? Remember, so what does migo mean? Migo means like, since this, then that. So we'll say, you hear what the shaila is? Really what it's a din almost is like, do we look at the cheftza? Do we look at the object of this cover as being an unfit cover? Since it can't withstand camels, and this is an area of high camel traffic, so therefore again, this is an unfit cover, and therefore again, you're a poshea. So whatever happens to the ox, you are going to be responsible, or no. In other words, had the camel walked on it, and then ultimately again weakened it, and the ox folded afterwards, fine. But that's not the case. Here, this was a case of rottage. And in general, as we spoke about, when you go ahead and you put down a cover, you're generally not liable for any subsequent rot which sets it upon the cover. Such a good kasha, no? Such a good case. So the Gemara says, Tashma, let's analyze. So, if you covered the pit in the right way, and a shara chamar falls in, umeis, and the animal dies, pater. The case over there was you covered it appropriately, and then it rotted. So the Gemara says, hey, Hidami, what's the case? Ilema karai l'sharon karai l'gemalim this liyam misocho pshita depater mahavel l'mavet. So it's about a case where you cover the pit, and the cover is good for chamer, gamal, and then it just rotted. So I will say, of course you're not going to be chayav. In other words, I will say that's the paradigmatic case of ones. In other words, you did your job, you covered it appropriately. Of course you will be ones. Elalav, listen to this, rather it must be the case of karai l'shvarim v'lo karai l'gemalim. It must be a case of where the cover was good for oxen and not good for camels. Ushchichi gemalim, but yet there's high camel traffic or common camel traffic. V'hesli misocho, but yet again the cover rotted. And that's why the ox subsequently falls through and dies. The katani pater, and yet we learn that it's pater. What do you see from here? Alma lo amrinan migo da havi poshel in gimalim havi poshel in asla. So I'll say, what do you see from here? We don't see that once you're negligent for camels, that we make you like negligent in general for everything that occurs with this cover. So I'll say that's the right thing. Lo, not necessarily. Olim krai ligmalim ukrai l'shvarim. The case could very well be where halacha l'maisa, the cover itself is fit for camels and fit for oxen. So we'll say, so therefore again, this is highest level cover. And what's the case? This liyam misocho. It rotted. Now the Gemara says, I will say, now if it rotted, now obviously I'm going to be pater. What else? The Gemara said, kakashi lecha ki esliya my havele me'avid. So you would say that halacha l'maisa, if it rotted, of course I'm going to be pater. What else should I do? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you what else. Ma'udetema, ibayle lemezel umenakesh alei. Let's say one might have thought that maybe even after putting the cover there, Rabbi will say menakesh literally means to knock on it. In other words, we'll say maybe there is a din of upkeep. Kamash malan, will say, the Gemara seems to say Kamash malan, that there is no din of upkeep, which Rabbi will say is fascinating. It's fascinating. So again, we'll have to see halacha l'maisa. That's true. But I will say what the Gemara seems to be saying over here is that once you covered that pit, and you know that you've covered it, again, I will say in a responsible way. Now remember, what's the definition of a responsible cover? What is the definition of a responsible cover? What's the definition? It depends, right? What does it depend on, right? What's the traffic in the area in which the pit is? Again, so this is very important. So remember again, the durability of the pit cover depends on the nature of, we'll call it livestock and pedestrian traffic along, that's where we're going to see all of this. But assuming you covered it in the responsible way, the Gemara seems to say over here that halacha l'maisa, there is no din of upkeep. Again, we'll see where that's halacha l'maisa. Let's go a little bit right there, a few more minutes. Tashma, lo kisa karai v'na falasoch shara chamar. Supposed to listen to this. If you didn't cover the pit appropriately and a shar or a chamar falls in, umeis, and it dies, chayiv. Yechayiv. Hechidanu, what's the case? Ilema v'lo karai l'shar v'lo karai l'gemalim. Tzricha l'nemer dechayiv. So we'll say, if you tell me you covered it in a way that wasn't good for oxen or for donkeys, for camels or for oxen, then we'll say, then obviously you're going to be chayiv, you're poshea. Elalav krai l'shram lo krai l'gemalim. Rather, we'll say, you're covering the pit in a way that is good for a shar, but not good for a camel. So let's analyze. V'idishchichi gemalim poshehu. Say if it's an area of high camel traffic, then you're negligent. V'idaloshchichi gemalim, and if it's an area where there aren't camels, onasu. Ultimately, again, it's extenuating circumstance. So what's going on over here? Elalav d'shchichi gemalim v'esliya misalcho. Rather, we're talking about a case where what? It's an area where ultimately, again, there is high camel traffic, but I will say, but that's not why it broke. It broke ultimately because it rotted. V'katoni chayiv, and yet it says you're chayiv. So we'll say, what do you see from here? Alma aminon migo da havi posheh le'inyin gemalim havi posheh le'inyin hasla. So I will say, what do you see from here? You see from here that once you put on that pit a cover that is not appropriate for the livestock traffic that goes around, you're a poshea. You're negligent. And if something happens and an animal breaks through that, even if it's not a result of the direct type of pshia. So for example, in this case over here, your pshia, your negligence is that you didn't put on there a cover that's strong enough for camels. But actually what ends up happening is that the cover ends up rotting, you're still going to be chayiv. Amar lo, not necessarily olam, kirai l'shram lo kirai l'gmalim. Really the cover is good for oxen and not good for camels. Ushchichi gimalim, and again we're talking about a case where it's common to have camel traffic. Here we go. So camels walked on it, weakened the cover, and then subsequently, again, oxen walked on it and fell through. That was obviously the kakashilaka pshita posheahu. So that's obviously, everyone will agree that's a case of negligence. Tushmar says, you're right. I did the nasiv reisha kiso karai, nasiv sefer nami lo kiso. So we'll see, you're right, in Achinami, this case is obvious, but in order to maintain some level of mishnaic symmetry, we included it. Let's go back to Tashma. Nafal socho shar cheresh shota v'katan. So we'll say, so okay, let's just pause here for just a moment. Let's just pause here. So we'll say, so halach l'maisa, what comes out from this interesting sugya is this idea that the nature of the cover has to be reflective of the livestock traffic that is traversing the area. So listen to this. So the Rambam Paskins, it's the same parak. Niskei Mamen parak Yud Beis Halacha Dalid. The Rambam says as follows: Kisal b'davar sheyachal lamo b'fnei shvarim, ve'eno yachal lamo b'fnei gimalim. I'm sorry. Kisal b'davar sheyachal lamo b'fnei shvarim, ve'eno yachal lamo b'fnei gimalim. V'holchu alav gimalim, v'nisro'eya v'holchu alav shvarim v'naflu bo. So we'll say, now watch this. So the Rambam frames the case like this: I covered my pit with a covering that is capable of maintaining the weight of oxen, right? And then what happens? But not of camels. Camels walked over it, weakened it. Afterwards, what happens? Oxen walk over it and fall through. What's the halacha? So I'm saying very simply: Im ein hagimala mitzuyim ba'osam makom, harei ze pater mipnei sheza ones. If halacha l'maisa, it is uncommon, right? If there's no camels in the area, it's uncommon for camels to be in the area, then I'm an ones. Then that's not my responsibility. Vim yavou sham gimal mafil leprakim harei ze chayiv. But I will say, if halacha l'maisa, camels come, they're even episodically, I'm going to be chayiv. So therefore I will say, the way the Rambam Paskins, and again, this is intuitive. So again, if I live in a place, so we'll say, if I dig a pit in Baltimore, right? And I go ahead and I cover it, I do not have to put a cover that is capable of maintaining the weight of camels. Why? There are no camels here. And I would say, but let's say now there's a traveling circus and it comes through, that's an ones. But you go ahead and you dig a pit, by in Gedi, in Eretz Yisrael, right? So now I make it strong enough for sure, I'm not forgotten. No. So there, even though maybe there's not a lot of camels there, because it's possible that camels come there episodically, you're chayiv to create a covering that is able to maintain the weight of any livestock that has the possibility of coming there, even if it's infrequently. Incredible. Now, I will say, the one part that the Rambam does not cover over here is the obligation ultimately, again, to maintain it. We'll come back. So we'll say, two major pieces of halacha that comes out over here. Number one, if you have a bar that is owned by two partners, right? Partner A, Reuven, covered the pit appropriately, and now partner B comes along and finds it uncovered, doesn't cover it. Partner B assumes full responsibility for the pit. Until when? Until enough time elapses that partner A is able to find out that the pit is uncovered and contract the necessary workers to cover the pit. At that point in time, if that amount of time elapses and partner A did not take the necessary steps, then what? They once again go back to a state of shared liability. That's halacha 1. Halacha 2, when fashioning a cover for your pit, halacha l'maisa, the pit cover has to be strong enough to maintain the weight of what is the commonly found livestock traversing the area. But if it turns out that a type of animal which never comes in the area now is suddenly in that area, and that animal either breaks through and dies or weakens it, so subsequently another animal breaks through and dies, that's an ones. That's an extenuating circumstance for which you will not be chayav. We'll stop over for today. We'll pick up with this tashma because it's the new case. It's the deaf-mute animal. We'll get to that tomorrow. We'll say, wow, what a start to the week. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Good morning.
2 quick things.